Over a number of months last winter, Dean and Paul published stories exposing the practice of energy companies force-fitting prepayment meters at homes of 500,000 of the poorest households in Britain. This came during a freezing winter and in the midst of a cost of living crisis, so it's a really relevant story. The key point is the meters are really controversial because energy is more expensive through them, and it's more likely that customers would self-disconnect their supply when they're in debt, leaving them without any power or heating. So it's a very timely piece of reporting through a very cold winter. The stories that they published include some brilliant data and undercover work. It's also a really rare example, I think, of two separate newspapers covering an issue without working on a joint investigation. So we're really lucky to have Dean here and Paul shortly today to talk to us about that as well. The impact of Dean and Paul's reporting has been significant. Both were nominated for the Paul Foot Award for Investigative Journalism this year, one of the highest accolades in the industry. But most importantly, the investigation also led to changes in government policy, sparked investigations by the regulator, changes in the judiciary system as well. I'll let Dean and Paul tell you a bit more about that. So Dean, could you just start by introducing yourself? Just tell us who you are and what your job is.
Yeah, my name's Dean Kirby. I'm the investigations correspondent at the newspaper. I've been reporting for 25 years, and I've worked on a few investigations the last few years. This was the main one really since last autumn over winter. So it was kind of work that took a few months really. Yeah,
I think we can certainly your experience shines through, and the quality of the reporting that you did on this story, Dean. So I'm going to start off by just sort of setting the scene. Dean pursued this story absolutely relentlessly. You published 40 stories and 6 front pages over 4 months. I think it's fair to say that you really pushed on and on with the issue. Your stories, Dean, revealed that 500,000 households in the past year were so deeply in debt over their energy bills that gas and electricity giants were forcing them to onto prepayment meters. It was described as disconnection by the back door and a national scandal. It was an issue affecting 500,000 people, but I think to some extent had perhaps gone under the radar in the media. So tell us, how did you first come across the story and how did it all come about?
Last year I've been doing a lot of work on Ukraine, and in the summer I was kind of looking around for a new story and started to see things in the media about the winter fuel crisis that was coming, and thought, well, this is going to be the big story of the winter, and started to think about how I could tell the story differently because it was already in the news. So started speaking to charities, just phoning them up, asking to have a Zoom interview, asking them what was going to be the big issue within that crisis, and all of them said prepayment meters. Those 2 words kept popping up all the time. And from what they were telling me, I kind of came up with a theory, really, that the theory was that energy firms, in the midst of this crisis, were going to be pushing to get more people onto these meters. So that was my whole kind of basis of the story, and started to try and ask questions about that, work out whether that was correct or not. So that was where it all started off, really.
Great. Were you surprised when the charity said this is the issue that's going to be the thing for the winter? Were prepayment meters something that were on your radar or not?
Not really. I hadn't even heard about them. Like most people won't know what they are, possibly. Yeah. And they were starting to say what the issues were with them and how people were being left in the cold and the dark over winter because of them. And it was just kind of like a bit really shocking, and I just thought I knew straight away that there's a story here, so just go for it and try and find out as much as I can.
We were going to do just a quick ask the audience actually. Could you just put your hands up if you've ever had a prepayment meter? So some people in the audience have. Probably about a quarter, I'd say, of the people in the room. One thing I wondered, Dean, and for both of you, when you first hear about this story, and meters and boxes and sort of physical bits of kit, debt, it could all sound quite dry. You know, how did you what sort of got you onto the story and thinking this is something that I feel passionate enough to do, to sort of pursue an investigation in this amount of time on reporting?
Yeah, it's really right that. I mean, going to an editor and saying, you know, I'm going to do a story about these little boxes that you have under the stairs that everybody has, and it's going to be a front page story. I think that it took a little bit of convincing at first to try and show that this was something that was really worth doing and spending time on. I think you've got to really go to the human aspect about it. It's not really about those boxes, it's about the people that are being affected by them. So once you start to find out about how people are really kind of suffering because of these things, that's when you know that this is the story really.
Yeah.
So it's about convincing them about the fact that it wasn't about the boxes but about the people.
Yeah. And it's this big point of self-disconnection, isn't it, that because people are in debt and can't afford to feed the meter, basically, that they turn the power off themselves, which really within the regulatory guidance isn't something that's allowed. So the companies were sort of finding a way to achieve the end of more power not being used and people getting further into debt, but really leaving them in dire circumstances because of that. Yeah,
that's it. And it's not about just having no gas or electricity. It's everything that comes with that. Everyone will have experienced a power cut, and there are people who in winter they're living like this for a few days at a time, and then maybe getting a bit of gas or electricity and then going off supply again, and it affects every aspect of your life. So you can't cook a hot meal for your kids, you can't wash their school uniform, so they go to school and they might get bullied because of that, because they're in unclean clothes. You can't like ring up the benefits office because your mobile phone doesn't work, so you get sanctioned on your universal credit, and it's just like a multiple of issues. It's not, I mean, sitting in the cold and dark is bad enough on its own, but it's everything else that comes with it as well. So affecting children's education, affecting their health, potentially affecting hospital admissions, like people getting ill from chest complaints and things like that. So there's a lot of things that come with it. Sure. I think that's what you're reporting, both of you, hones in on so brilliantly. Your work particularly, Dean, is a really fantastic example of really determined and forensic data reporting. You get the figures, you find out how many of these warrants are being granted. You sort of go back and push the data to get richer stories. So, I think at one point you sort of tease new angles. You find out how many of the prepayment meters are going to people with disabilities, 1 in 5. It's all in there, isn't it, in the sort of granular detail of this tells the story of the vulnerabilities and what's going on. Could you just tell us a bit about how you managed to get that data, how much FOI work was involved in what you were doing? Yeah, as an FOI request initially to the Ministry of Justice, I've done a lot of requests since then to them. But I think sometimes you can overcomplicate FOI and try to ask too much. But I just asked them a very simple question of, can you send me a spreadsheet of how many of these warrants have been granted in the last 18 months since the last COVID lockdown? And can you tell me which courts have been doing them as well and how many of them are being done? So that just came back quite quickly. It wasn't complicated for them to give me that information. And that was the start of it from there. So I had this data set, but I wanted to, it wasn't really enough because it's just, at the end of the day, a set of numbers, even though it's quite shocking, there are big numbers. But you need also to get the human aspect of it, case studies, and also went into court as well, which was a big part of the story really as well. Yeah, I was going to move on to that. I think so the next day, with good journalistic instinct, then you start thinking about, well, how can I find out more about these warrants? What are they being granted for? Who are the people that they're being granted against? And you start some quite extraordinary court reporting, actually. There's an amazing line in your stories, Dean, where we hear about you attending a hearing where almost 496 of these warrants to forcibly install meters were granted in just 3 minutes and 51 seconds. In a beautiful detail, you say you know that because you timed it with a stopwatch, which is great journalism. I think it's that sort of tiny detail can really bring home so clearly what the issues are.
I know that it wasn't easy for you to get into that hearing. Could you just tell us a bit about how much work it took to actually get access to this court session?
Every reporter will have been to their local court and just walked in and had a look at all the cases there, anything that they want to do. But I thought I could do the same. I just rang up my local magistrates court and said, when have we got these cases on? And they said, oh, what are these? We don't know what they are. And can you you should go to this other court, I think they might do them. And then I was being passed around courts all over Greater Manchester, and like nobody seemed to know what they were. And then some court officials were saying, oh, well, we do these in the back office, we don't do them in court. And another person said, don't even go there, you don't want to bother with that, you know. And I was just trying for ages to do this. And I managed to make contact with I found a really good contact who just kind of came out of the blue, and he knew about the system, he knew what was happening on the doorstep, and he'd already been to court to cover these cases in the past. Well, not cover them, he was involved in them. And I was saying to him, like, I want to get into one of these courts, and he managed to come back to me and said, right, if you go to Wigan Magistrates Court at 9 o'clock on Tuesday, there's one of these courts taking place, and it won't be announced. There'll be no notices on the door. It'll happen just before all the normal court cases start. So I went there, and the ushers were saying to me outside court, we don't do these cases. I don't even know what you're talking about. And so I went down to the office and said, I'm here for these cases, and they went, yeah, oh, all right, okay, it's court 9. Went back up there, and the door was unlocked, and I went in and spoke to the usher, and the usher said, oh, this guy's a reporter, he's asking about these cases. And the clerk came in, he said, oh yeah, I know there's a reporter here. So the case just started, it just happened. Yeah,
I mean, I can see how much frustration probably there must have been when you were trying to chase these hearings. You know, I can imagine an editor saying, you should just be able to walk into court and see this, but no, not that simple, weeks of work. And I imagine a mix of sort of being assertive and trying to be quite friendly to court staff. It is hard to get access, isn't it, when people are determined that it's not something that's happening, or that it's not something you should have access to.
They were all being very helpful and friendly, and like ushers are always helpful when you go to court, but they just didn't know anything about it. Yeah. So.
That whole picture, I think, perfectly illustrates how little scrutiny is going on about these warrants moving through the courts. Even the court staff themselves don't know that the hearings are happening, and then you see the quantity of warrants that are granted. Were you getting a sense at that point of there's something wrong with the system here?
Yeah, I was, and I kind of knew that this. I'd worked out that this was what was happening, that because I had that spreadsheet and you could see all the numbers, and at first I thought, well, they must be doing so many a day, but I managed to. I spoke to somebody who's a caseworker in London, and when I met her, like, we spoke on the phone for a couple of hours. Really, she just wanted to tell me everything that was going on, and she said, look, I don't think they are doing it that way. They're doing these in batches. She came up with this thing, and she'd seen something in like an old select committee report, like a paragraph, and she said they're rattling through this. This is what's happening. So when I went to the court, I was expecting that to happen. That it'd be done so quickly, and so that was kind of the last thing that I needed to build the picture. Yeah,
and it does very compellingly as well. In terms of impact, Dean, in your reporting, I know one of the things that happened afterwards is that one of the country's most senior judges instructed every court in England and Wales to stop granting these warrants that allowed the gas meters to be installed. The key point is that the courts should have been considering whether any of these customers had vulnerabilities that would have meant that their power shouldn't be cut off. And the speed with which these warrants were being processed kind of clearly showed that they weren't doing that, and that so the magistrates and the judiciary itself became a bit nervous about whether this was actually following the rules. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. They really do rattle through them, and there's no kind of information presented to the magistrates as well, so they have a little spreadsheet which just has names, basically names and addresses on it, not much else. And when I was there, this voice comes on the phone of a debt collector, and they say, well, we've got all these people, we've checked them out and they're all okay to have these meters, so the magistrates don't ask any questions, they just say yeah, okay, and then that's it, and it goes, it's all done.
Sure. So in your reporting, you've established the scale of the problem, you've established the issue with these warrants being granted incredibly speedily and without scrutiny. And the next sort of facet of your reporting is showing the impact of this and the sort of human impact and how it's affecting people. I think you heard accounts of engineers turning up with dog handlers to forcibly fit meters and people calling the police. It all sounds incredibly distressing. One of the issues I think you've talked about coming up against with your reporting, Paul, is a lot of your case studies are anonymous. And that was despite the fact that once you published, I think you said your newsroom was inundated with calls from people that were affected. Was it difficult to get people to go on the record? Do you think, is there a stigma around debt and actually going public about these sort of issues?
It was really difficult, and obviously newspaper editors, they just want case studies, don't they? And the big problem with it is there's such a stigma around debt, and these people are kind of like hidden people. They are very poor, they're really struggling. I spoke to a couple of like single mothers, and they were worried that their children might be taken off them because they were living in this way. So they didn't really want to, they didn't want to be identified, but it was difficult for them to speak about it as well. They just didn't want to put their heads above the parapet, really. So people really struggling.
Yeah.
Difficult.
Did you have any pushback from editors about using anonymous case studies, or such a compelling sort of public interest case and still getting these stories out there despite, despite the fact that people were so uncomfortable with being named?
Not really. They was kind of keeping up requests for case studies and keep trying to get people to speak. But I think that they knew that this had to be told in the way it had to be told, really. Yeah,
absolutely. Your reporting had such an impact, Dean. You've done things like given evidence to the Welsh Parliament. You've become sort of almost an expert on this issue. You've talked a little bit though about it was a sustained piece of work over a number of months. What sort of stress is involved in doing a story like this and working on something like this?
I know that these weren't the stresses that Paul was under doing undercover work, and which he's done amazing work doing that. But I think it's something like we don't talk about as an industry, really, about the stresses of this kind of stuff, because you're very much, like me, I was very much on my own, working from home. And with this story in particular, you're kind of criticising the government, the energy companies who've got millions of pounds. You're criticising the court system, so all the big things. And with any story, you've got to get everything right, but with the investigation in particular, everything's got to be absolutely perfect, and you can't make a mistake, because even if you make a small mistake, people can use that to pick a thread at everything that you've done. So you've got to be really careful, and it is really stressful to do that. One of my contacts I made was somebody who just came out of nowhere, and we kind of became friends. We were like talking every day about this issue, and he would ring me up and tell me things that he'd found out, and I would speak to him, and he became like a bit of a support for me, like saying, oh, you're on the right track here, this is right, because everyone else, it was kind of carrying on, and nothing was changing really, and it's really helpful to find somebody who can be a helper to you and offer you a bit of support that isn't the news desk. I think
absolutely. I think we've heard already, I think, through what you've said, the value of contacts, even with getting the tip off about the court hearing, and that it's just, they're worth their weight in gold, aren't they?
Yeah.
For context, for information, for all sorts of reasons. That segues nicely into Paul and the undercover work that you did. Paul, I'll just let you introduce yourself. If you just say who you are and what your job is and how long you've been doing it.
I'm Paul Morgan-Bentley. I'm head of investigations at the Times, and I worked on the same story essentially as Dean over the past winter, but kind of exposed a different part of it by going undercover.
So Paul, you first published in February this year after Dean's original reporting started in December the previous year, a really hard-hitting piece of journalism about debt agents for British Gas breaking into the homes of vulnerable people to fit prepayment meters. You know this because you witnessed it yourself when you went to work undercover as a debt recovery agent. Fascinating. So could you just tell us a bit about the story and how it came about? How did you end up sort of on the path of thinking that this was a piece of undercover work that you'd like to do?
So very similar to Dean, actually. Interesting hearing from Dean as well. And I think lots of people can assume that undercover, that investigative journalism is all kind of tips in a pub, and you kind of get something or through kind of secure drop or something like that, and sometimes that happens, but also sometimes it's about being creative and thinking ahead and what's coming next. And it sounds like we were having very similar thoughts. It was kind of this time last year, I remember sitting down with an editor, and there were loads of stories about the cost of living crisis and how hard the next winter, so the winter that's just been, was going to be. I'd previously done work on debt collectors used by the government and how aggressive they were being. And I just had this thought, which was that surely during the cost of living crisis, when everyone's going to be struggling next winter, so much noise, surely the big energy firms aren't going to be doing this next winter. That would be so callous, but let's check. And similar to Dean, started speaking to people and then found out about prepayment meters and thought, why does no one know about this issue? I've never heard of it. I didn't realise that people could, obviously that there are different options when you're an energy customer, but I didn't realise that people could be forced and that energy companies had a specific way of going to the courts to get warrants to break in a way that other companies don't have that power. And it all just really fascinated me. And then also I think in terms of, you talked about kind of editorial challenges, perhaps in other years there might have been more of a pushback in terms of, are these people really incapable of paying, or are they just not paying? They talk about in the industry can't pays and won't pays. And any other year I think that that might have been a harder barrier and that scepticism might have been there, but because of the cost of living crisis and because of how much everyone has been struggling and everyone can relate to your bills going up so much, I think we felt really strongly that there were bound to be people here that, very serious vulnerable cases where they shouldn't be having these meters forcibly installed.
It's such a good point, Paul, because I think we can all, everybody was worried about what their energy bills would look like that winter, weren't they? And then when you think back to households that are already struggling with the cost of living crisis, you can feel the pressure that would have been there. Just tell us a little bit, Paul, about the process of going undercover as much as you can. What did you have to do? Did you have to create a fake identity to get the job, or what's the process you go through to actually become the debt agent?
Well, right at the beginning, it wasn't like let's go undercover. The first thing was, how are we going to cover this issue? And we came to the conclusion that the best way of exposing it was to go undercover. Part of the issue was that you had charities already talking about this quite loudly, and Dean referenced that as well, that when Dean came to it, already there was a bit of noise about it, but at the end of each of the articles, or whenever the companies were put on the spot, they would say, this is a last resort, we never do it when customers are vulnerable. The people that have this done to them are the people who are refusing to pay. And sometimes where undercover work, I think, can be really, really useful is where you have that disparity. And you don't know who to trust, because you can, every time there's a case that come out, they can say, oh, that was a one-off, that shouldn't have happened, that was one rogue agent. It's not, something that's a problem across the industry. We do all the checks. The magistrates, what Dean found, how they were doing this in bulk, that was all on the basis that these companies were doing the checks, because they'd so convincingly told everyone that they were really thoroughly doing the checks. Well, they weren't. And then, so we got to a point where we wanted to go undercover. I'd actually made, the application was it, and I should say you go through a very tight legal process. with our editors, partly due to the IPSO code, but also, you know, you're just making sure that it really is in the public interest to do this, because there's obviously a level of intrusion. If you're going undercover, if I was undercover now, no one would know I'd be wearing a camera. There's intrusion there. People kind of, people find that intrusive, so you really have to be satisfied that the public interest is there, but also that you can't get to the bottom of this in any other way. And I'd made the application, and that's when Dean's first front page came out. I remember my colleague on the investigations team at the Times, Billy, saying, "Have you seen the Eyes front page?" And I kind of looked at it and had a kind of gulp in my throat. I thought, oh, you know. But then actually, the more Dean was writing about it, and it was a really kind of funny period, because I was also working on the same issue, and I was desperate to send Dean a message. Many years ago, I was a trainee reporter at the Mail and got sent to the Manchester Evening News as a trainee to build up experience. And Dean was one of the reporters there, and I remembered his name. And I was like desperate to send him a message and say, "I'm also working on this, I'm trying to go undercover," but I couldn't. And then the actual, in terms of the practicalities of the undercover work, I think lots of people can assume you have to use fake identities and stuff like that. For some undercover work, you definitely do that. Actually, when it comes to a job like this, because I had to apply for the debt collection agency, they check your national insurance company, your national insurance number. They check your, you know, they do criminal record checks and all that kind of stuff. So you do have to use your own passport. I, you know, have a double-barreled name after marriage, so I kind of keep some things in another name, and I, you know, you can sometimes use a middle name. You can do things like that, but fundamentally, if you're applying for a job, you do have to use your own details. And it never ceases to amaze me how these companies do the criminal record checks, and they do all different types of financial checks, but no one Googles you. And
perhaps we shouldn't tip them off to...
No, exactly. And it's amazing, because I've done this kind of work undercover for companies, and colleagues have numerous times, and you know, maybe sometimes they find you out, but it's amazing the number of times they don't.
It's really interesting to hear, and I think many people might be surprised to hear that you go in under your own name, basically.
Yeah.
One of the really unique details about both the work that both of you were doing is that, as you've explained, Paul, Dean was publishing at the time that you were in and actually working undercover, which gives you an incredibly unique insight into what's going on. So one of the key details in your reporting is that at the point that you're there and working, Dean publishes a story and the government makes an announcement saying, "That's it, we're going to stop doing these forced installations." You're on the ground the day that happens, you read it. Just tell us about what happened after that.
It was a Sunday morning, I think, and Dean tweeted, and I was in bed, and I'd already been undercover for a few weeks. And the key thing with the undercover was I could see from Dean's reporting this frustration that he had such amazing evidence about the court hearings. He had these case studies, but obviously, like you were saying, debt issues, people... It's such a big ask for someone to be photographed and named to say that I've got a prepayment meter because I fell behind on my bills. You know, people feel shame about that. And the companies kept saying, you know, we check carefully for vulnerability. And even kind of that seemed to be the noise from the government. And Dean had done such good work that it was already very much on the government's radar. And then Grant Shapps had come out, the energy minister, and said, "We're writing to them to ask them to stop now this winter." I'd spent the last week in teams breaking into people's homes. I had evidence that they definitely were vulnerable. You know, one of the people we were sent to was the mother of a 4-week-old baby. She was standing there crying with her newborn baby. This idea that they'd done any thorough checks is just, you know, a joke. And the idea that a newborn baby would be left in the cold. And she was talking about how she didn't know what to do because she needed the heating for her baby, but that she also had older kids and they needed to eat. And she was also a really good example of where she had always paid her bills, and it was only due to the cost of living crisis, her bills had increased 7 times. So it was just impossible to pay. And now they were forcing a prepayment meter onto her. So I'd done that for a week, and then I wake up on the Sunday morning and I'm scrolling on my phone in bed, and I see Dean's tweet saying that Grant Shapps has ordered them to stop. And I kind of think, that's brilliant news, but also I haven't published yet. You know, you gave me a heart attack. But then I thought, do you know what, this is really interesting, because none of the companies have come back and said they are going to do it. So let's see what happens tomorrow. And lo and behold, on the Monday I was sent out again. We were breaking into people's homes again. So the companies were just ignoring. And another thing that happened was actually the CEO of Centrica, which owns British Gas, had come out and said they'd stop this thing called remote switches. So either you break into the home and literally an engineer changes it over, or if someone's on a smart meter, they can just do it remotely. And people find that very sneaky. They don't even know it's happened. They just get a letter through their door saying, we've switched you over and now you're on pay as you go. And so he had come out and said, we're going to stop that. But actually that week, after he'd said that as well, we carried on doing that. So actually, in a way, it really helped after the initial panic attack, after seeing your tweet. Because actually, and I think that's where the two investigations, Dean's and mine, it was a real, I think people can assume journalists are always kind of competing, and you are to an extent, obviously, but I think they really helped each other, because they carried, and actually Dean had managed to get into the court. I'd tried, and I was still trying. And I was told that it had to be an online hearing, and I had all the same frustrations as you, being told, no, journalists can't be there, and all that kind of stuff. And so your reporting was amazing, because you'd got in and proved that part of the story. So I think it was a real team effort between papers, which is quite unusual.
In practical terms, I think the amount of ground that you both managed to cover, because you've got these two separate strands running through your separate investigations, would have been impossible to do all of that work as one journalist and still be able to publish that winter. So even the practicalities tell you that you needed two people, and newsrooms probably wouldn't have dedicated two reporters.
When I was trying to get into the courts, I was going to have to do, another reporter was going to have to go, because I didn't want to give the courts my name while I was undercover. And what happens if they told the debt collection company that we've got a reporter called this coming in, and they think that's one of our agents? You know.
That shows the stresses too, Paul, doesn't it? The level of thinking you have to have around what you're doing. You've so brilliantly summed up there the fact that, you know, this happens. The regulator has said that they shouldn't be doing these forced installations. The company have said that they're not doing it, and the government has told them to stop. But you're there and seeing them do it on the ground literally the day after they've made these big announcements. So it really shows, I think, the public interest case that you had so clearly established before you went in was kind of justified in bringing this issue into the public domain. The human interest angle in your reporting, Paul, as well is so strong. You paint such a vivid picture of the families that you're seeing when you go in as a debt agent. There's a description you give of one of the living rooms: toys on the floor, bottle of Calpol, an asthma inhaler, clothes drying on a radiator, all of these things, so, you know, key to having power. I just wondered, how were you documenting what you were seeing? Because you're there obviously doing a job, you know, do you have cameras? Did you have to go home and make copious notes each night? How did you actually sort of do your journalism and keep a record of what was going on?
So I wore hidden camera. Part, with the legal process, part of the public interest considerations, you don't just do that before you go in undercover, we do that throughout. You continue doing it. So one of the decisions we made was that we were happy filming, even in people's homes, on the basis that we would reassess later. We're not publishing that footage, we're not making that decision yet, we're satisfied I can film to gain evidence. And then later, you then reassess and think, what can we film and what can we... And then the video team at the Times had a very tough job, because how we ended up doing it is we showed footage of me outside the homes with the British Gas vans and the other agents, the dog handlers, like you'd found out about. We were being sent in with the dog handlers, the locksmiths picking the locks, but we were very careful to blur anything that would have been identifiable about their homes and their streets. And then what we did was the screen kind of blacks out as I go in the home, and then either it's me kind of voiceover that I did afterwards explaining what I could see, or there are bits where you can hear the debt agent. And as I walked into that home, it was a single dad with 3 kids, and the debt agents had checked with the next door neighbour and they confirmed that it was a single dad with 3 kids. We then broke in, the locksmith picked the lock and we went in. There was a tiny little puppy who was terrified, and the dog handler kind of hooked the dog and took the dog away. But yeah, I've got a 3-year-old son, and I could see there was at least, the youngest child must have been young. And there were toys on the floor, the kind of toys that very young kids play with. And then there was this asthma inhaler, and the agent had seen it, and I'd pointed it out to him that there was this child's asthma inhaler, like obvious sign of a very young child with a vulnerability. And we'd gone in there, and the radiators were hot, they're warm, and clothes were drying on them. And they proceeded, and you know, he's on tape saying in his recording device, no vulnerabilities noted, plough on. And we changed it, and we left, and the radiators were cold, locked the door back up, and the the guy would have come home with his kids to a cold house.
Yeah, so it just really brings home exactly the situation that these people are facing when the power goes off. I should just add that, and to be clear, the British Gas and the Debt Recovery Agency said that the views and actions of individual employees did not reflect those of the company, and the company said that they acted in accordance with the regulatory requirements. So just to put the case for the companies. I just wanted to briefly, before we move on to the impact, which you've just touched on there, Paul, talk about some of the later reporting that the Times did, then starts to look at profits. With all of this going on, the company's share price fell, I think, actually, after both your investigations were reported. British Gas chairman said he was truly sorry, but the net profits at Centrica, the parent company of British Gas, were still 7 times higher than the previous year. Why was it important to then follow up on that angle? And just wondered how much you thought this was a story about companies flourishing in a system that was providing very little protection for the poorest.
Well, it's very much part of the story, because it kind of baffles me, and I wonder if you feel the same, Dean, that they carried on doing this through the winter, because it was such a callous, such a horrible thing to do for these families and so devastating. But you imagine, like, how much debt are they actually recovering from that during the coldest months of the year, this winter, and the cost of living crisis, such an extreme time to be carrying on doing this. And then at the same time, they're making record profits as a company. And they would say, well, actually, the kind of residential arm doesn't make that money. It's from other parts of the business. But it shows that it's not like they desperately needed that money as a company. They were just ploughing on, and it almost seemed kind of thoughtless. There were some other companies that suspended it themselves over the winter, and I think that was clearly a very smart move of them. And they avoided the kind of PR disaster of having this exposed. But British Gas, Centrica, just carried on. And I think that is very important to people, and people do get very upset about the huge profits these energy companies make, or the oil companies make, because at the same time we're all facing the massive increases in prices that affect us every day and our kids, and so yeah, it does become a significant part of the story.
Absolutely. You touched on there how your investigations were complementary, although separate, and the impact that you've had, which has been significant. I've said to a few people that I think actually you may possibly have the most impact I've seen from any investigation that I've been following in recent years. There was government action, regulatory body inquiries, the courts issued changes, so you've got that triple-pronged effect. And part of that comes, I think, because Dean's reporting so brilliantly paints the big picture of what's going on and how many people affected. Paul, you come in and show a very specific and forensic example of bad practice. Dean, you described it to me as you felt that you were sort of pushing a boulder up a hill with your reporting, and you wondered whether the boulder would have gone over the hill and that amount of change would have happened unless Paul had come in with his investigation. So could you just talk a little bit about that and how much you were aware of each other's investigations and how you think they sort of complemented each other?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It did feel, I was totally unaware of what Paul was doing, but it was like pushing a boulder up the hill, and I was kind of thinking, it was kind of balanced. I felt it was getting near the top and maybe balancing a bit, and could it go over the edge, and maybe I kind of don't, this part of me thinks it wouldn't have done it. They, like Paul said, they were still continuing to do what they were doing. So then Paul's amazing investigation comes out on the front page at the Times, and I remember seeing it and saying to one of my news editors, like, this is going to happen now. This kind of rock is going to roll down the other side of this hill. It's going to actually happen. And it was such an incredible story, a way of telling this what was happening, and it was a real tipping point in the whole picture, really. This incredible thing.
You can see that impact, and it's really interesting to hear the timeline actually of how you were both working and get the inside story on that. Both of your investigations, as I say, led to significant change. The government, Grant Shapps, the minister, came out and was very clear that these forcible installations shouldn't be happening. There have been inquiries. The courts questioned whether the warrants were being issued as they should be. What's the situation now, and what do you think is going to happen this winter? Will we be seeing these forced installations happening again?
There has been some changes. Ofgem has introduced a code of conduct, which isn't. They announced yesterday that it's going to be enforceable, but the changes within it are quite limited. So over 85s are not going to have to be forced onto the meters, which are a very small proportion of bill payers, and it's well above the average life expectancy as well. I think that this is being done, and this means that these warrants are going to come back again for this winter. It might even happen just before winter starts. The people who are campaigning against it, they're saying that the only way to change this is to stop forced installations altogether, and the energy bill is going through Parliament at the moment, and there's some attempts to get some amendments into the bill to try to do that. In the 1990s, there was a similar situation with water, where water companies could put limiting devices on people's pipes or could disconnect your supply. And there's a big campaign against it, with doctors getting involved, and they were saying it was really unhealthy, this, and the law changed to stop that, and that was kind of a real watershed moment, and we've not had that this time. It's just going to continue again.
Yeah, just to add one point before we ask you the same question, Paul, I think there's a great line in your reporting, Dean, where it's kind of deep down in one of the stories, which just shows, I think, the thoroughness of your work, but it talks about the system in France, where there are no prepayment meters and state-owned EDF is only able to reduce power to a minimum, enough to provide light and keep the fridge on. I think EDF is one of the companies that provides power in Britain too. So it's such a brilliant line for showing that the system can and is different somewhere else, that there is a choice here, that it's not a case that we have to have these meters. And I think it's a great sort of compelling line within your reporting. Paul, just talk to us about what you think is going to happen this winter, maybe around the debt recovery agents. You know, what do you think you're going to be seeing happening come
well, kind of exactly what Dean said. We definitely have more work to do. We had, after my story came out, there was a huge change really quickly. It was very overwhelming. I've never experienced that before, and I'd love to say it was all because of my work, but it was very much because Dean had done all this other work, and then it was like the final tipping point, exactly how he said. And also I think there's kind of personal things going on where, like, Grant Shapps, the minister, was very personally embarrassed because he had come out and made this announcement that I've ordered them to stop, and then they carried on. So he was made to look weak, and then he could act much stronger after that. But exactly what Dean said, there's been the response from Ofgem, which is the regulator for the industry and is notoriously not very strong and has been very heavily criticised in the past. They've come out with a new code of practice all about protecting vulnerable people, but then you look into the detail. Firstly, it was agreed with the energy companies, and you know, that says something in itself that they were willing to sign up to it.
So do you mean the government statement was agreed?
The government regulator, Ofgem,
yeah,
has come out with a new code of practice.
But they agreed that with
but they had done it with the energy companies to make sure they were on board with it before they announced it. And then we both looked into the details, and yes, over 85s are going to be protected with a full ban on this. But actually, for instance, households where you have very young children are not covered by the top category, which is do not install. There's a separate second category, which is classed as kind of a bit less risky, and they say they're going to be doing much more thorough checks on those kind of people, but it's not an all-out ban. So actually, the Centrica boss came out after our investigation and said he was shocked by what we'd found. But actually, that mum with a 4-week-old baby, that could still happen to her under this new code of practice. What happened yesterday was Ofgem came out and said, now it becomes a statutory consultation. So it's not just going to be a voluntary code, it's going to be full legal change before this winter, where if any of the companies breach this, it'll be part of their licence conditions, we'll be able to revoke their licence. So they'll have to keep to it. But as part of it, there was a line buried in it which said that after they announced the voluntary code of practice, they'd spoken to 3 experts from the NHS who all said the full ban needs to be extended to homes with under 5s. because it has such devastating effects on young children if they're in cold and damp homes. It affects them, in so many ways, health-wise, developmentally. Babies can grow less than they should. And it's interesting that Ofgem, instead of taking that advice which they'd sought, instead of then changing the code and saying, when it becomes law, we're going to include under 5s, what they've done is they've said, we're launching this consultation, we want more views about this. So it's really important now that charities and campaigners respond to that consultation and make these points and say, if there's going to be a ban, not just over 85s, it has to also be homes with under 5s. Why 85? It should be 75, and getting as much as there can be before it becomes law. I think in practice, firstly, the debt collection company I worked for, they've been sacked by all the energy firms. They're not doing any of this warrant work anymore now, which is positive in light of how they were operating. In practice, I don't know if you agree, Dean, I reckon they'll probably be much more careful over the next year because they don't want to be exposed in this way again, and they know we'll be looking. Maybe it lasts another year. My concern is you have these new laws, and then what happens in 3-4 years' time, gradually they start becoming more aggressive again. So that's why this point now, before the law changes, is really crucial to have the full ban as strong as possible.
Really interesting to hear, and I think perfectly sums up why it's important to have that journalistic scrutiny there, that this sort of public interest journalism is coming out. I think you've talked so much there about families with children under 5. So many of your case studies are those shocking stories. So it's at least there and on record if people are making representations that they can point back to those specific cases. Sorry, Dean. Go on.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say that there hasn't been any changes to the court system, so and no sign of that happening. When the warrants do start again, then we're still going to be in the same situation of the courts rattling through cases quite quickly, and we know proper oversight of them. I'm really kind of surprised that nobody's really suggested that there needs to be changes there, because magistrates have, complained about it. So we'll have to wait and see.
Just to finish with a figure perhaps that shows still the scale of the problem, I think, again, Dean, a good piece of data work from you showed that the installation of prepayment meters actually reached a 5-year high in 2022, 39% more than the previous year, despite all the scrutiny that was going on from the reporting happening in both of your newspapers. Just a quick kind of sum up from me. I think, Dean, you told the Welsh Parliament when you gave evidence to them recently, you said water has been something essential to life and electricity and gas haven't been seen in the same way. I do think they should be, because they're so essential for modern life. This should be a watershed moment like that in terms of making real changes, referring back to the change that did happen after a similar focus on the water industry in the 1990s. So I wonder if the legacy of this investigation is that you have started to establish that case that power and heating, should be and essential to life, and this is something that shouldn't be able to be cut off by the energy companies in this way.
No. So there was a rota, essentially, we were sent emails, said, these are your jobs for the day. At the time, I was still shadowing as part of my training, so I was there within the teams, but I wasn't leading a team yet. But yeah, I was kind of waiting in the morning for a call to say we've all been called off, and it didn't come. And I drove there and thought maybe we'll still get the call, but because you'd wait for the kind of final sign off that yes, go in, and it never happened. So no one referenced it. We did also have a WhatsApp group for the team, and whilst I was undercover, there were a few people were sending kind of links, probably to to stories, and saying, "Oh God, are we all going to lose our jobs? What's going on? It all looks a bit worrying here. There is more noise about this." But then we'd just carry on. I think these companies are so big. So Grant Shapps sends a letter to, I don't know, the CEO of Centrica, and then assumes that means a message will be passed down. But it doesn't get passed down. So then when it comes to the teams on the ground all over the country, you're not getting an email from the CEO of Centrica saying stop.
No.
I mean, you'd expect it to come down through the management, but that didn't happen. So it could be willful from the top. I mean, we can't really talk to that because we don't know, but certainly on the ground, we weren't told.
Just to add, Paul, there's the flip side, and you're seeing this, is that they're being incentivised with a bonus structure to actually get these meters in, aren't they? So that not only are they not being told, but there's an active sort of system there that's incentivising doing the work.
There is some personal risk. It's a funny one because I do undercover work, and I also kind of manage people that sometimes do undercover work. And I really see that some people are suited to it and some people aren't. And there's lots of things that I get very anxious about. But for some reason, I don't know why, I don't get anxious about undercover work. And I think it's partly I get much more nervous about something like court reporting, and actually speaking to something that Dean was talking about, as an investigative journalist, you don't want to make one mistake, because even if it's the smallest thing and there has to be a correction in the paper, then your editor starts to kind of really feel like they have to watch you a bit more closely. And trust is so important. If you want your editors and the legal team to trust you and put these really serious stories out there, you can't be making loads of errors and causing corrections. And I think I get much more anxious about, have I got that down perfectly? There's something reassuring to me about wearing a camera and knowing, yes, there's some personal risk, but as long as the camera's on, I'll go home and then I've got time to go through it all. And I know that it's accurate because I can check it 7 times. So no, that wasn't a huge part of my consideration. It would be if I was overseeing other people, making sure they felt comfortable, but I feel very comfortable doing it. I think also we work with a company that lots of different investigative journalist teams work with, and they're so sophisticated, and we have them, I sometimes wear them in a shirt button, and as long as you're wearing a shirt, actually this would be a good shirt for undercover work because there are dark buttons. So usually there'd be kind of 4, I mean I shouldn't give away too much, should I?
It's fascinating for us to
hear. There's a secret, it's not like you're holding a phone out. It's not bulky, and so I'm never worried. I mean, they have cameras in phone cases now, and bags and glasses, although I don't love the glasses ones. But there are different aspects to that actually practically, if anyone's interested. One thing I really had to get my head around early on and really try and teach people is that, like in a room like this, if I was wearing an undercover camera in one of my shirt buttons, the way I'm sitting, I'd probably be filming the ceiling. And if I wanted to be getting you two, I couldn't be talking like that because I'd still be filming there. And it's kind of learning to shift your body and do those kind of things. But I think the cameras are so sophisticated now that I don't worry hugely that we'll be found out because someone spots something weird about what I look like. Yeah, I'd be open to it. We haven't so far. What we tend to do is just like send each other DMs and be like, this one's coming. Or, straight after my undercover story dropped, I sent him a really long DM being like, I was desperate to get in touch with you for ages. We haven't actually worked on anything together, but actually it's probably good idea. We should probably talk about that ahead of next winter to make sure they're not doing anything dodgy.
You want to? Very good.
Yeah, well, no, we haven't really worked on anything, but he's coming back again this winter, so maybe we should have a chat for him and see what we can work on. I managed to get hold of some of the letters that debt collectors were sending out to people about the court cases, and they're very confusing. And they'll say, in one part of it, it'll say you don't have to go to court, and then another page it'll say if you want to fight this, you need to go to court. And it gave lists of courts that were all over the country. So one of the letters was the person was in Sheffield, and the courts that were being offered were one of them was on the Isle of Wight. And I think these kind of letters are difficult for people as well when they're vulnerable and in difficult circumstances. I've also seen as well that since the court ban has happened, that the energy companies some of them are sending letters out to people saying you're in debt, we can come round and force our way in and fit a prepayment meter. And they know that they can't do that currently, but they're still kind of threatening people with it, which is a kind of misinformation, isn't it, to put pressure on everybody. So lots of information, problems really it's not very clear to people what the process is either.
It's interesting, I think another thing that I've seen, which is people with very good intentions, but sometimes you have these kind of viral videos of people standing up to the debt collectors and saying things, giving advice that isn't necessarily true. Some of these people are very accurate and very good, but some aren't so good. And they'll say, they're not allowed in your home, you tell them this, and you just shut the door. And sadly, the truth has been that that isn't true, that if they've got a warrant, they can come in and they can call the police to help enforce that warrant. So, and what that can lead to is just people being more aggressive on the door, which leads to more problems. So it can just wind people up a bit and not necessarily in the right ways. Like the types of people online who'll say, don't pay your parking ticket because they'll never take you to court. Well, they do take you to court now. Like that might have been true for a period 10 years ago, but that's not true right now. Yes, it's not always helpful, that stuff. Yeah, it was what we didn't know was exactly what the deal was between Arvato, the debt collection company, and companies like British Gas. So on what basis were they being paid? And I think you'd only really get to the bones of that if you saw the details of that. But there must have been, I'd speculate that there must have been something similar to that involved, because that's the way the agent's pay worked. So I saw it on the ground with the people I was shadowing. If we went and we had to leave the job and not fit a meter, they got, let's say, 1 bonus point, which was worth, let's say, £1, whatever it was. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head. But if we went and force fitted a meter at someone's house, they got 2 bonus points and they got £2, or whatever it was. So clearly, whatever the structure was, the effect was that it was incentivizing them to go through with it. You spot the asthma inhaler, if I walk away now, I'm only going to get 1 bonus point. But if we carry on and just get this done, then I get 2. And the company came back and said things like it's to do with time because it takes longer. But whatever the reasoning behind, the effect is that it encourages people to do it. So in terms of the practicalities, I was talked earlier about you have to use genuine identity documents if you're going for a job in the UK. But I'm not going to be applying with my CV saying, and I've been at the Times, and before that I was at the Mail, and, and I studied journalism at Goldsmiths. I'm not going to be saying that. So we're careful not to go too far, but we work on kind of CVs and things like that. And then there was quite an annoying and long recruitment process. Meanwhile, Dean's publishing, and I'm like waiting for them to get back to me. And then even once I had 1 interview, and then after that interview, there was a week of training, which was remote training. So I was at home, kind of desperate to get on with actually getting on the job. But I was undercover for that period and recording that, and getting some useful stuff. But I really wanted to get out on the ground and see what was happening. And then I was out on the ground. I think it was 3 weeks before we published. And Dean's reporting definitely sped us up, which was good. With other jobs, I have been tempted to kind of take a bit longer, but because of all the political momentum that was going on because of Dean's stories, it was just such a perfect opportunity to get it out there.
Thank you.
And then you talked about backstory. There's no kind of hard and fast rules, but I do think sticking as close to the truth as possible helps, because what you don't want to be doing is telling someone you've got a wife and telling someone else you've got a girlfriend and someone else you've got a boyfriend. Like, you don't want to get yourself kind of into holes because you've said different things. So I tend to keep generally close to the truth without giving kind of family members' names and stuff like that. Yeah, and I've talked about kind of relevant work experience and stuff like that, and that the company that I'd worked for had gone into liquidation, so I was looking for a new job quite urgently. And then there is an element of personal risk. If you're going to use your own byline, and this is true of undercover and any other risky reporting, if you're reporting on some kind of big fraud or you're exposing some other criminality, if you're happy to use your byline, people can probably find you. I'm quite careful about things like open registers, and at the Times there's a team that checks these things and makes sure that my home address that they can't find that, and the Times are good about they pay for security at my house and stuff like that. I mean, not like cameras and things like that. But there definitely is an element of risk, but this is what I tell my husband anyway, that there's an element of risk with any reporting if you've got your byline on your story. On the backstory, there's not a huge amount. You know, I just try and stick pretty close to the truth. I feel like I don't pretend to be someone else or very different. I have almost been caught out before. There was one job I did where I was talking about seeing something on Twitter, and one of the other kind of new recruits was like, "Oh, I'm on Twitter, I'll follow you." What? And I was like, "Ugh!" I like quickly changed the subject. And so you have to be careful of stuff like that, because when you are feeling relaxed, you can just say things like that and you never know where it goes. But yeah, I don't come up with an elaborate backstory. I really, it probably doesn't sound very sexy, but I just kind of try to be myself as much as possible. Yeah, so there's always kind of that anxiety about, you know, if you've got let's say you've got a camera in a shirt button. Actually, this didn't apply for this job, but a different undercover job I did a year before, which was at the DVLA. They were very strict about us wearing like our name things around our necks. And it was an absolute nightmare, because that's exactly where the camera was. So I kept holding I kept getting these official warnings from my trainer, being like, "You have to be wearing it." And I was like, "Oh, I keep forgetting." And you know, I would just like keep it in my pocket. So you do, and then with this job, I just made sure it was cold. So I just had like a jumper, but made sure it was like a zip-up one, so I could always see. There was one point, actually, there's quite key footage of us breaking into someone's home. And actually, we were quite raised and on like a wooden wall. And I was very conscious of not missing the moment. And so I was kind of like very unusually kind of leaning down, pretending to like stretch my legs. But that comes with experience, because I know exactly what you mean. And it happens sometimes when other reporters go out, and you know, just even something as simple as you're sitting like that, you're getting someone in front, you relax too much and you're getting the ceiling. So you have to be very aware of things like that. And then the other anxiety is like, is it recording? Have I it's that OCD thing, like have I definitely switched it on?
It's a new level of have I turned the dictaphone on, isn't it?
It's exactly that. It's a really interesting question, and what I like to do, in case it's helpful to anyone else, definitely don't want to be benefiting and getting the money. I also don't want the money sitting in my account. So what I do is something that's happened in the past, if you write a check from your account to the company, they might never bank it, so it stays in your account. So I use postal orders. So if you go to the post office, you can take cash out, get postal orders, and then I send the postal orders to the company. So it's whether they cash it or not, it's out my account, I haven't benefited.
So just to clarify, Paul, so you would take the money that you've been paid and actually give it back to the company that's paid it to you once
yes.
you've obviously
and I should say, actually, it was quite a nice touch. In this case, usually they just take it. In this case, Arvato, the debt collectors, said that they were using it to give a donation to Step Change, I think it was.
That's fascinating. I didn't realise that detail, and good to hear that you do that as well. We are out of time, so thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience too. Great questions. Thank you so much to Paul and Dee for holding this service.